To today's public safety hearing over the noise code policy in the city of Columbus. I am Councilmember Emmanuel Remy, Chair of the Public Safety Committee. I just want to remind everyone that this is also being broadcast live on YouTube and Facebook, and it's also being live and being recorded for rebroadcast on CTV, Columbus's government television channel 3, and that schedule is available at www.columbus.gov. So we're here today to review a handful of draft code amendments to the community noise code section of our city code for feedback and to answer questions. I'd like to take a moment to explain how we got here this afternoon. And so in November 2022, we originally held a joint public hearing, myself and Council President Pro Tem Rob Dorns, to hear from the community regarding noise and mobile food vendors. At that time, we decided to split up the work into different phases, as both areas of code and legislation are very complex. We spent many months researching, discussing, holding meetings, and reviewing draft code amendments for mobile food vending, and ended with code amendments passed this spring with implementation in May. In July of this year, we held a second public hearing on draft amendments to the noise code. Using the feedback from that July hearing, there have been numerous changes and improvements to the current draft we are considering here today. We felt it necessary to host this hearing to discuss these changes and receive more feedback. So in front of us today includes the latest round of code amendments the Public Safety Committee would like to review. If all goes well, we will continue by passing these ordinances or these changes before the end of the year. So obviously, as we are a growing city, we have growing concerns about people's quiet enjoyment of their home, where they live and the community in which they reside. And so as a big city, it needs to operate as a big city. How we regulate and force noise in Columbus will need to change as we continue to grow. I'm grateful to all of the residents and business leaders that have been involved and given feedback. And I encourage you to keep reaching out to my office to share your noise-related concerns, issues, and needs. So at this point, we will get right into the meat of this, and I'd like to welcome John Oswald, our Senior Legislative Analyst for Columbus City Council's Legislative Research Office, who will be presenting this evening. I'd also like to thank our department partners joining us this evening to help answer questions and provide feedback. That's City Attorney's Office, Sarah Pomeroy, Senior Assistant City Attorney Zone Initiative, Director Messer from Building and Zoning Services, Deputy Director Michael Holloran from Public Safety, Commander Christine Nemchev from Patrol Zone 4, which is the Short North and campus area, from Columbus Police, and Edward Johnson from our Public Health Department. So without any further ado, I am going to turn the presentation over to John. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Remy. I'm going to do a brief overview of community noise that we've discussed at length in the previous two hearings too, and then detail the changes that Council and the administration are proposing. So noise remains an issue of public concern, not just as a quality of life issue, but as an environmental health problem as well. The World Health Organization has found that noise is the second largest environmental cause of health problems globally, following air pollution. A study by the National Institute of Health showed that exposure to high decibel noise can lead to high blood pressure, heart disease, sleep deprivation, increased stress levels, and other health issues. In terms of quality of life and complaints from the public, while they have been steadily decreasing over the past several years, the city still received between 15 and 16 complaints per day on average regarding noise last year. So just looking at the snapshot that we've shown before on noise complaints in Columbus, in the past 10 years, the Columbus Division of Police has fielded over 93,400 calls in reference to noise complaints. A vast majority of those complaints were fielded through the police non-emergency line. When 911 calls are made, those are automatically diverted to 4545, the non-emergency line. Fewer than 1% were officer-initiated calls. Noise complaints, like I mentioned, have been generally decreasing since 2012, but still remain an issue. Looking kind of where this happens, you can look at it by precinct, where the complaints came from. more complaints by far over the years in Police Precinct 4 than any other precinct. This covers OSU campus, top half of the Short North and 5th by Northwest areas. But you can see it's an issue not only in downtown commercial corridors, but also in the second and third highest incidences we had in Precinct 6 and 10 came from far southwest Columbus and Northland out towards New Albany. Generally, the most common time for lodging complaints for folks is between 11 p.m. and midnight. That's 14% of all the calls that were received. 62% of complaints are made between 10 and 7, generally recognized by the code and comparable codes nationwide as the time when noise should be kept at a minimum. Almost half of complaints are made Friday to Sunday, so on the weekend, and nearly half occur between the months of May and September, so the warmest. How are these complaints handled right now, and how have they been over the past several years? Nearly 47% of the time, contact is made by police and/or the party is advised of the complaint. In about 52% of complaints, either nothing was found or no contact was made. Less than 1% of complaints result in a citation issued or report taken. And in only 0.15% of cases, 143 since 2012, was an arrest made. So taking a look at the section in code that governs community noise, this is 232911. There's 7 main parts to the noise code that we had, again, detailed in previous hearings. Details for sound levels for land use districts. This is the amount of sustained noise at a certain decibel level that you can make depending on use. Prohibited sounds. So this is one that the loud sporadic sounds that disturb residents. Deals with exemptions to these, an inspection procedure, variances, issuance of orders, and penalties. So the main sections we're looking at for potential amendments here today are in prohibited sounds, the variance procedure, and in penalties. So in looking at prohibited sounds, so this pertains to the type of sound where they emanate. So the standard right now is any person is prohibited from making any, quote, unreasonably loud and or raucous noise in such a manner or at such a volume to disturb the quiet, comfort, or repose of a person of ordinary sensibilities. This applies citywide right now. It also regulates the use of sound amplification systems, auditory devices, any device that generates sound, and stationary sound sources like standing motor vehicles, industrial equipment, fans, HVAC units, etc. So right now, no person can generate sounds from these sources from properties zoned residential in a manner as to be heard from 50 feet beyond the property line from where the sound emanates. And when there are 2 or more residential units in one structure, the same applies, but it's not allowed to be heard from any more than 25 feet beyond the property line of the unit. And that also applies when there's adjoining residential properties located within 50 feet of each other. And right now, the section does not currently address commercial property. So the proposed amendments address the absence of taking exception with any but residential properties. So the proposed amendment will address prohibited sounds by creating a, quote, red line for non-residential properties, such as currently exists for residential through additions to Section C and minor adjustments to definitions and other language throughout the section. And here are those changes that will do that. It will prohibit the operation of any sound amplification system, auditory device, or stationary sound source from a non-residential property that's audible at the property line of a residential unit 100 feet from the property line of said non-residential property unit. And this will apply between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. Within multi-unit structures or adjoining properties, each with a residential unit within 50 feet of one another, the prohibited sounds cannot be audible within the residential unit of that structure when it's 25 feet away from the residential unit from which the sound emanates. This makes for a clearer standard than the property line, which can be difficult to define within the same property. And another amendment is that this introduces the Department of Building and Zoning Services as a city agency that can enforce the provisions of this section. Columbus Division of Police and Columbus Public Health already have the ability to enforce, and that would remain in the code. However, BZS would be introduced and taking a more substantive role in that. In addition, we were looking at what additional tools could help out with giving us the ability to enforce. And so we have the addition of a civil penalty option for commercial or other non-residential property owners that violate the prohibited sounds section. Apologies. So it would set up a fine structure for that, and it would be as follows: for $500 for the first violation, $1,000 for the second, and $5,000 for the third, and each subsequent violation occurring within a one-year period. Some grounds for appeal are detailed in this section, as is the method for appealing itself, which is a requirement for civil offenses under our code. Appeals can be made within 15 days of notice of the violation to the Property Maintenance Appeals Board, which currently handles code enforcement issues. That board would conduct a hearing on the appeal within 45 days and issue a ruling 5 days following that. Other amendments include ones that were previously detailed in July. The elimination of an existing variance for prohibited sounds through the Department of Public Safety. There already exists a variance for excessive noise levels in land use districts. That is obtained through the Board of Health. That would not change. There's also one that currently for non-regular prohibited sounds. That would be eliminated as something of a redundancy because there's already a permitting process through Rec and Parks, and for now safety for various kinds of events and legitimate sources of noise. It would, as written, raise the penalty for repeat offenders. A violation of the Community Noise Code remains a criminal offense for individuals, with the exception of the civil offense option. A single occurrence is a minor misdemeanor. If an offender persists in making noise after warning or request to stop, the violation would be a fourth-degree misdemeanor. The proposed amendment would raise any repeat offenses following this from a fourth to a second-degree misdemeanor. There's also looking to introduce a limited exemption from prohibited sound standard and the land use standard of existing land use properties for which the adjoining property zoning changes, for example, like existing manufacturing operations. A few other changes. We use the term audible instead of as in a manner to be heard. The former is more legally objective. Introducing non-residential property and residential unit into the definitions. Changing the definition of property zoned residential to include property in areas zoned for mixed use. Introducing use of sound level meters in the code as an enforcement tool that could be used to monitor land use levels, or include future use of stationary units to collect evidence against offenders. And introducing organizational criminal liability under the penalties, which means a corporation, limited partnership, similar entity can be found in violation of the section and not just individuals. In addition to those penalties available, Building and Zoning Services can also file a civil action in the Environmental Division of Franklin County Municipal Court, seeking an order to recover any accumulated civil fines or for injunctive relief. This is a remedy that already exists for the city attorney to pursue, but we're making it explicit in the code language itself. And for some just quick comparisons here, generally penalties and enforcement kind of runs the gamut in larger and peer cities to Columbus, but most of them have, almost all of them have the red line in common, where they have an audibility standard where if you can hear it from a certain distance from a property, then they find you in violation. So the code amendments would bring us in line with that. Penalties are across the board, some criminal, some civil. Introducing civil to ours would bring us up to speed with a lot of other cities. And enforcement the bodies that enforce run the gamut as well. Police do it in some situations. Code Enforcement Board does it in Louisville. Los Angeles has a noise enforcement team within their police department to do that. And others, similar to us, health, police, and licensing can enforce. So it does run the gamut on that there. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Are there any comments or questions from any of the department heads in regards to this presentation right this minute? No, good. All good. All right. Let me go to Commander. What's the status with Columbus Police on how you guys are currently enforcing noise complaints, and what are some of the issues that arise?
Christine Nemchev, Zone 4 Commander. Our most effective enforcement for noise complaints is to make contact with the homeowner or the business owner and let them know that a complaint's been made, and then we usually get compliance. Sometimes once we, sometimes when we leave, the noise comes back on, so we'll have to return. In the campus area, we found it effective. We have a joint patrol with Ohio State Police, where Ohio State Police and Columbus Police work together. And if we know that an event is coming, like Chit Fest or a home football game, and we've had complaints, we'll go door to door. We'll identify who lives there. We'll advise them of the student code of conduct, let them know the consequences of if they get a citation or if they violate the noise ordinance. So that has been most effective on campus. In the short north, we have different kinds of noises. Some of them are enforceable, some of them aren't enforceable. For example, ride shares will constantly block High Street, so people will beep their horn because they'll be getting riders in and out of their car. That's not a violation of law, so we can't enforce. That's not an excessive use of a horn, so it's a loud noise, but it's nothing that we can enforce. People will soup up their mufflers and their exhausts and rev their engines at stoplights. That's not anything that we can enforce. So there are noises that make the ambient area loud that are beyond our control.
Assistant City Attorney Pomeroy, during our July hearing, we discussed how the City Attorney's Office needed a red line in the noise code to truly participate in these issues. So do you feel like the draft amendments in front of us today cover that? And is there anything further needed from your point of view?
Yes, they certainly cover it. That bright line without it does make the commercial noise ordinance as it presently constitutes very hard to enforce, next to impossible. So the amendments certainly accomplish that goal.
John, she brings up a very good point, not behind you, from a police perspective. She mentioned that there's not much they can do for a souped up muffler and that sort of thing. What could we do to address that in the code? Because certainly cities have taken that approach when people have excessive vehicle noise, whether it's racing, whether it's, a loud muffler, all that type of thing. Is there something we could do with the code that would make something enforceable?
Chair Ramey, thank you. There are a few things that we could make a little bit more explicit in code. However, the prohibited sound statute is pretty clear on the kind of the subjective level of noise that someone will tolerate. So, a backfiring lack of a muffler would violate. It's just very difficult to kind of catch them. Where we mention enforcement tools for use in the future could be of some effect, especially partnered perhaps with a civil penalty to catch folks via stationary sound meters, that kind of thing. But it's kind of difficult in code we could be a little more explicit in the kind of activities that would do it, but they would still be subject to some provisions that we already have. But I think that enhancing enforcement and giving them the tools to do so would be probably the most effective way to do that.
I know our office investigated noise monitoring cameras out of the UK as a potential solution. They're using them in New York City, for instance, and so that was a path that we've been looking at. Back to you, City Attorney. I'm kind of back and forth, but this current draft contains a progressive structure for criminal penalties. Could you explain that further? And if you think, is that the right amount? Do we feel that we'll be in line? I think John could answer part of that, but do you feel like this is it seems to me like it would be, it'd catch somebody's attention if they were to violate.
Certainly agree. It's not uncommon, I think, even in our own code to have a progressive penalty structure. And I think that does give sort of, a chance for a first-time actor to, hey, this is, not okay, this is not allowed. But then it's, the subsequent penalties, I think, should escalate. I think one comment I would also add that to the extent you have chronic violators, we already have the ability in the code to bring a nuisance abatement lawsuit against a chronic violator, even separate from the penalties. So I think penalties are certainly effective in explaining exactly, the consequences of continuing to violate the code, but also we have an injunction process as well that I believe is also amended into here. So we've got multiple different ways. I would defer to John as far as comparing other cities, but I think it certainly meets the goals here too.
Sure. Chair Remy, I would just add to, as far as peer city comparison, this would not classify us amongst, the harshest penalties, as the penalties are kind of across the board, but they do trend on the civil side towards lower dollar amounts for individuals, and definitely like lower level misdemeanors. I think LA is kind of an exception with their repeat offense. They do an unclassified misdemeanor that's akin to something like our first degree. So that would be seen as pretty harsh. Some have made moves to examine penalties kind of in the lens of equity. I know there was kind of a case study out of city of Baton Rouge in Louisiana where the state had enacted pretty harsh penalties in response to a lot of resident complaints. However, they did have the ability to lessen those at the local level, and Baton Rouge had taken a lot of input from the public and decided to do that for a bit lighter touch, especially since a lot of the penalties were very new, and they were worried about being overly harsh. So that's definitely something that we can keep looking at.
Okay, thank you. Director Messer, how do you guys currently interact with noise and noise complaints? This is kind of a little bit of a newer area for you, right? Obviously, you've got the building inspections and inspectors and others, working through your code enforcement, working through your office. So this is kind of adding to that. How do you anticipate, setting this up? I know you've been giving this a lot of thought, and so just wanted to hear your perspective as we roll this out potentially next year.
Chair Ramey, thanks for having me here. I appreciate the opportunity to comment. Yes, Building and Zoning Services is primarily becoming involved due to our code enforcement division. So our code enforcement officers are currently out in the field dealing with a number of different nuisances, usually related to housing concerns. But in this case, now we'll be a part of the noise ordinance, allowing us to address noise as a public nuisance in essence. So, our intention is to follow up on complaints as they're made. So, for example, a residential citizen makes a complaint about a bar or a restaurant that is consistently violating the noise ordinance. My code officers would be able to go out, enforce the standard that is now going to be in the code that prohibits those noises, and follow up with the appropriate penalties.
How I want to, there's one particular piece in here that I'll just throw it out there to John or whoever, but we talked about existing manufacturing, and especially those that could be in close proximity to residential. What are we doing about that? Because we certainly don't want to put extra burdens on our existing businesses or manufacturers that have been operating for long periods of time within these levels. And certainly, as we think about new regulations, what are we doing to address that?
Chair Remy, yes, we're definitely taking a look at that and trying to work with BZS and take into consideration existing land use operations, for instance, manufacturing that were previously existing and, the adjoining property zoning changes. I would defer to Director Messer for some details, perhaps how that works from the zoning side.
Sure. Chair Remy, I'd be happy to address that. Essentially, what we're trying to accomplish with the language that we're proposing to put into the code is, in essence, to grandfather someone who has an established use on their property. So you mentioned manufacturing as a current citizen who owns a manufacturing property. If they are surrounded by other manufacturing properties that were to be changed at a later point in time to residential, they would remain subject to the original land use that was there when they established their use. So the point being, you can't essentially come after the fact to a citizen who has an established use and impact what they're allowed to do by changing the zoning.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask public safety, and one of my goals throughout this process is to take a little bit more burden off of our police to allow them to do other things, and certainly that's where Director Messer comes in. But from your perspective, what we're proposing here today, how do you feel about that, about the changes, and will it be helpful to lower maybe some of the burden that, because again, police make these runs, they get there usually it's all quieted down by then, or they know they're coming, and it's a waste of resources to have them running out there to not catch them. So I'm just interested in your perspective.
I believe the stats that Mr. Oswalt put up were illuminating from the sense that it appears that a large number of these complaints are not dealt with immediately with penalties right off the bat. So I believe that the structure that's put into the proposed structure of this new ordinance that allow code enforcement through Building and Zoning Services, as well as the Department of Health and the Division of Police, collaboratively all three to address these issues as these complaints roll in should, and I'll defer to Commander Nemchev on this, should help lower that burden as well as increase compliance and enforcement with it.
Thank you. And Edward, from your perspective with public health, I mean, there's responsibilities that you currently hold, and do some of these changes help your area? Is there more that can be done?
I think that we would be very supportive of these changes. Most of what the Department of Health is dealing with tends to be that stationary commercial manufacturing noise. Through our observations, we haven't seen anyone who kind of wants to offend without end. When there are manufacturers or commercial entities that do abut even existing residential properties, they tend to want to be good neighbors. And so we have observed at times they might fall slightly above some of those thresholds, but they also say, what can we do to mitigate those noise complaints? And so for us, we have, at least in the past 10 years, I don't think we've granted or seen anyone apply for a variance at this time. And I think that speaks to, at least in that stationary context, how helpful this is and how this can be helpful in other areas.
Thank you. And, if we look at the presentation that John made, there's a lot of problems at night. Government typically isn't necessarily operating at 24/7. What are we thinking about for some of those late night issues? Is it fall back to police? Like, what is, I'm kind of looking at Director Messer here, but what do you envision?
So that's true. A lot of the violations and a lot of the disruptions do occur at night. And we're preparing for that. I think We're still going to have your true disturbing the peace calls that require an immediate response. If something happens at 3 o'clock in the morning, we're not precluding the fact that a police officer may have to respond. But I think for repeat violators, some of the entities that consistently on weekends, I saw the stats that, more than half of the violations occur on the weekends. And that's probably because your typical bars and restaurants and parties and things like that happen on weekend nights. And so being able to staff it appropriately to be responsive is something we're going to be looking at to make sure that we can respond and adequately protect our residential citizens from these unwanted noises. But we will have to make a difference between sort of the occasional once in a blue moon disturbing the peace at 3 o'clock in the morning versus sort of a consistent bar or restaurant or other entity that, maybe someone has parties every single Saturday night, or an Airbnb that rents out and has disturbing parties every couple of weeks or something. Those are calls that I think code enforcement will be able to go out and, really focus on more of the nuisance properties that are repetitive.
And I know we've had long discussions about potentially noise code enforcement officer specific, their noise monitoring. Again, I know public health has some, but they're using those types of things in New York City and other big cities. I mean, again, I know you've been taking a very holistic look at what it means, and some of these things we have to grow into because we're starting from kind of a ground zero in some respects. Again, kind of asking your vision.
I think we have done a lot of research. We've seen a lot of cities that have made use of noise enforcement officers, and especially if as we take over a more proactive enforcement role, if that becomes something that we think is necessary, we would be prepared for that. A lot of cities that are growing, like Columbus, take kind of a hybrid approach, similar to what we're doing now. They enact language that empowers not only health and police and code enforcement, but also noise enforcement officers. And then you sort of cover the gamut for what you might have in the future. I could definitely see us, as we move forward, understanding what our role would be and how, how the actual requirements of my department are evolving. We may move to something like having dedicated noise enforcement officers, that's all they do. But I think we're open to that. I think we're going to start with using our current code enforcement officers to enforce and see where we go from there.
Thank you, Director. So any other comments for the good of the order before I turn it over to our public speakers? Oh, yes, sir, Director.
I do have one more comment that I want to highlight. When we looked at the enforcement part of this, and as code enforcement takes a more proactive role, I think it's important that we understand that a lot of these complaints are twofold. You have the individual or person who's actually violating the noise ordinance at the time, but you also have owners of these parcels that are allowing some of these nuisances to take place. And our intention, as we get involved both with the civil penalties as well as the type of enforcement action that code enforcement generally takes, is we want to make sure that we have the opportunity to hold both parties accountable. Not only someone, a DJ or someone who's actually causing the violation at 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock in the morning, but also the owners of those properties that continue to allow this nuisance to occur.
Thank you. That's a very important point. So, all right. Well, we have 3 public speakers this evening and received 2 pieces of written testimony, which we will make sure everybody gets. But I wanted to invite up Cheryl Roberto. Ms. Roberto, you state your name, address, and any organization you may represent, and you have 3 minutes to speak. And on deck is David Underwood.
Thank you, Chair Remy. My name is Cheryl Roberto. I don't represent anyone but myself. I'm a resident of downtown. Love living downtown. It's lively. Lived in German Village before. Very lively. Love it. Really appreciate your attention to noise because it is influencing our ability to enjoy where we live. I want to share with you two instances that are ongoing of experience of excessive noise that I'm concerned are not addressed by the language that you have currently before you. One is, and it was referenced by the commander, the revving of engines and motorcycles racing up and down High Street here. I know folks in my building have called and there's been no response. It sounds like it's because the Department of Public Safety doesn't believe they have the tools. So I want to highlight that I don't see that in this ordinance either. The second instance is there are amplified sounds from South High Street, the sidewalk in front of the State House. These are not like State House demonstrations, but on the sidewalk. Amplified singing for hours at a time throughout the summer to the point that we live on the 12th floor. We can't have a conversation. I can't do a Zoom call, can't hear your own music. I went down and spoke with the folks who were doing the amplified music and asked them, explained to them how much their sound traveled up and really made it impossible for us to hear, and they wouldn't respond. I called a couple departments in the city, public safety, the city attorney's office, and said, surely they must need a permit. No one claimed any ownership of them, and I don't see anything in this ordinance either that would enable any part of the city to address what they apparently didn't believe they had authority to address before. And then finally, I would just urge you to ensure that if you have an ordinance, the folks have the tools to enforce it and the resources to enforce it, because as I said, that's not what we're experiencing right now. I mean, if you read the existing language, what we've experienced shouldn't have happened, and it did. So thank you for your time, your attention to this. We really appreciate it. Do you have any questions for me?
No, but very good points, and we appreciate you bringing those to our attention. We'll make sure that, we're working towards addressing those things.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. David Underwood and then Derek Bonar.
Thank you, Chairman Remy. I certainly agree with the previous speaker's comments regarding vehicle noise and the fact that that's not incorporated into anything we see here today. I'm here on behalf of myself and my son who lives in the Short North. I work in the Short North. I work for a property management company in the Short North. We had an experience recently where a resident moved in on the 17th of November, and this last Saturday at 2:30 in the morning, she sent an email to our property manager to say, I gotta move. I can't stay here anymore. This young lady is gonna have a baby sometime in the next few weeks. And to be in a residence for such a short period of time and then already reach out to us at 2:30 in the morning to say, I can't live like this, it's really disappointing that she has to go through that, and we've got to help her navigate that situation. And I think that that's just one of many examples that I could give you from our residents in the Short North. As the father of a son who is living in the Short North, just a half a block off of High Street, I'm disappointed to hear that he needs to have a white noise machine to sleep at night. And I was thinking about this, when we write commercial leases, there's language in there that grants that tenant the right to peaceably enjoy the premises. We grant them that right. But nowhere do I see this being reciprocated, and certainly there's no contract for that. But this is the mechanism, I think, through City Council to make sure that the commercial businesses that are generating the noise, wherever that might be in the city, are bound by whatever you do here in the council to reciprocate this right of peaceable enjoyment of the premises. So I think that is something that is very important and as I think about that, we grant this right as a landlord, but there's nothing that says that right has to be reciprocated back to us. And the other thing I want to comment on, in Section C, Section 2, under prohibited sounds, we talk about this 100 feet audible at the property line of a residential unit that is 100 feet or more beyond the property line of the property from which the sound emanates. So as I read this and I think about residents who live above, if you live above a bar, if you live above a business, you're not 100 feet away. So I would ask that we strike or amend this language here so that we are taking into consideration people that live above these businesses who are technically not 100 feet away. So I'd like to see that 100 feet eliminated so that we are thinking about those people that live either right next door, buildings are touching each other, or they live above the business that's causing the noise problem, and just eliminate this requirement for 100 feet of separation between the business that's generating the noise and the resident and the property that they live in and those property lines. Thank you.
Thank you. John, in the legislation, we do address like a multifamily situation. Isn't that correct?
Chair Reby, yes, that's correct. It would be addressed in that section that the gentleman was referring to with the 100 feet, and that would apply for anything, whether it was, you know, the same unit or an adjoining unit or units separate. It's also addressed in residential to residential noise within the same unit, and putting the standard in that the distance would have to be 25, if audible, past 25 feet away from the residential unit of the source of the noise. So to make a bit easier standard than property line in there, because what they really wanted to get at was, can the person hear the noise, not an arbitrary line from which you measure from their wall or something. Are they being disturbed? So yes.
All right, thank you. And then last but certainly not least, Derek Bonar, please state your name and the organization you may represent in your address.
Hi, my name's Derek Bonar. Thank you for having me. Just coming as a resident, I've lived and worked in the Short North the last 12 years. Really just glad that we're kind of finally doing something about it. Lived on High Street for about 2.5 years, and kind of had to move off of High Street just because of how noisy it is. And it really seems like kind of bad noise chases bad noise. So, it kind of starts out where there's a bar or restaurant kind of bumping speakers, loud music outside, and that turns into, motorcycles and loud cars and people kind of, on the sidewalk, a parked car making a bunch of noise. So I really appreciate you guys kind of coming together and working on something. I'm now several blocks off of High Street and still, have that bad noise chasing bad noise. Like if I take my dog out at night, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm over 25 houses away from High Street, and I can still kind of hear the High Street noise. So, there's a 100-foot rule or 25-foot rule, but, the fact that you can hear it blocks away. And I think, again, it goes to point of, those cars. And I'm not sure what the mechanism is on listening to it. It's not really cars with mufflers per se, although I think it is a souped up muffler in some examples. But, it's a lot of times, especially in the summer months, bumping music with their windows down, or motorcycles with, speakers put into them. So I think kind of starting with some of the bars and restaurants and, neighbors to neighbors, that kind of, good neighbors breed good neighbors. So I'm glad that, we're able to work towards something, especially as Columbus is growing. So appreciate it, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate your comments. Are there any final comments for the record from our department partners? Well, then, seeing none, we will close out. I just want to thank everyone who joined us today for a robust conversation over this draft of noise code amendments. We're planning to have final amendments up for a vote by Columbus City Council before the end of the year. We will use the feedback shared today to form the final legislation. But once these amendments take effect, we intend to review the results after a year. BZA will be collecting data and complaints, and we will be asking for a report back to analyze those results. We are excited to see how these changes will improve the lives of our residents, and I encourage you, again, to reach out to my office to remain engaged as we enter the final phase of updating the Columbus Noise Code and gather feedback. Thank you to John Oswalt for your presentation and work on the noise code amendments, and thank you to all of you that attended today. We appreciate the work that you put into these amendments. I want to thank the council team members who made today's hearing possible, my legislative aide, Avery Townsend, my analyst Kaylin Pittman, Mark Carter, and to the CTV team for their assistance in preparing for this hearing. And last but not least, thank you to the stakeholders and residents who attended today and for your outreach in between hearings and meetings. I hope you all stay safe, stay warm, and have a great evening. This concludes today's hearing.